So as you can see now, we've shifted our attention into ZBrush. All I've done here is import the OBJ files which we exported previously into ZBrush, all as separate models, and then as you can see over here, I've just combined them all into various subtools underneath the head. That just makes it a lot easier to work with. I can save it out as a tool as well. It just makes things a little bit tidier. And I can just go down here and select these separately just to work on them individually. So now it's just a case of going in and starting to detail the various elements. So let's just have a quick look at the head. I'm just going to go in, we'll smooth the UVs, and I'm just going to add maybe a couple of divisions. And all I'm going to do is, I've got the standard brush there, just reduce that down, or maybe a little bit bigger. And all I'm going to do here is just going to start maybe enhancing some of the larger areas, like around his eyes. You know, just painting in these extra details. And again, all these will just come through in the displacement map when we go back into Maya. We just want to add this to make it look a bit more, you know, add a few more wrinkles in there, some creases. You know, this is just very quick. Maybe just drop it down a little bit and just to make the eyes look a bit more like they're sort of folded and wrinkly skin, rather than, I mean, if we look over here at this eye, it just looks a bit flat and basic, so we can just go in and add in some of these. And I'm not getting into tiny details just yet, just trying to focus on these larger areas first. There's no point trying to get ahead of yourself and run before you can walk. You know, at this stage we could do whatever we want. We could even add big bags under his eyes or anything really. And you see, I'm not using any fancy brushes or anything like that. I'm just using the basic standard brush just to start painting in some of these details. So when you're happy with that stage, and if you've gone through and started to, you know, we could even go in and make his head a bit more bobbly and less uniform just by adding in things like that. Do the same over here. You know, just to make it look a bit more deformed and uneven. But then we can just go in and start adding more divisions, and as we get into smaller and smaller details, we can start to think about adding in the actual wound on his head. But before we do that, we just need to add some divisions to the actual stitches. And as you can see, these are just basic squares which we just brought in from Maya. I'm just going to close that down, geometry, just divide those a few times just so we've got like sort of a rough guide of where the stitches will be. Let's go back to our head, reduce that down, and then let's just see where we could take this cut. Now we know we need it in between these stitches, and it's still quite a low resolution mesh, so as you can see the cut is quite sort of polygony and rough. but we're just getting a basic idea at this stage of where it's going to go. We could add that joining onto there, we could leave it open. Doesn't really matter. So now after we've done that, we can still see all these polygons. So we do need another subdivision in there. And now we can start going in, use a smaller brush, just maybe enhancing these cuts where it's been stitched together. We can see here we've started to come away from the stitches, but we can also start to think about how the stitches are affecting the skin around these wounds. So we need some sort of holes where it's coming out of, because these wounds aren't exactly closed properly, they're still quite open. But again, we're still just working on a low resolution mesh. Now, I'm not going to go into too much depth and just spend ages going through and sculpting the whole head in this video. This is just to give you a rough idea of sort of the process I took when I did sculpt the head. And again, once we've gone through all of this, and even around the lips, add another division. And now I'm starting to think, well, the cut's a little bit wide. Let's just drop this down a little bit more. Just enhance some of these. You know, add in some stretch marks, because the skin around here is being pulled, and you know, enhance the edges of the cuts as well. And if you're not sure about how this is supposed to look, I mean, I'm going for a more sort of stylized look here, but if you're wanting a more realistic look, then feel free to have a look online for some reference. I mean, there's plenty of wounds and things on there that you can find. But now we're working with a finer divisions on the mesh, we can get a bit more detail in. You know, just get all this looking like it's all being pulled in, because they're trying desperately to get those stitches to seal up that wound. And then we'll just increase that, and then we'll just go in with our smooth brush and just soften some of that off. You know, you get the general idea. You know, you want to take your time and, you know, have some fun with it. Experiment a little bit too. You know, just follow that procedure all around with each stitch. You know, while you're working on this, you know, higher division, you can also go in and just start to add in some more details around the eyes as well. Enhance some of those wrinkles and creases around there. Let's go down to the lips now. And again, just the same sort of process. We want them to look like they're being forced shut. Kind of like that. And just soften those off. And then it's just a case of, once you've gone through, add another division. That'll soften it off a little bit more, and then you can go in and just add in some more finer detail. Even use some of the alphas just to add in some cracks and things into the skin. Let's have a look. Where's that alpha? So something like this. Let's make that bigger. Just undo that. So that was probably a bit too intense, so let's have a look. Reduce our intensity down, maybe to 10. We'll invert that. So you could do something like that. Just to add in a bit more skin detail, we could drop this down a bit more. If you're not sure about adding these bits on, remember you can also use your layers. So you can create a new layer and just add these on a layer at a time. And just dragging it like this, it's just adding a bit more detail to the surface. Could even go over here and add some cracks over near the mouth and near the wounds. But that's pretty much how I approached doing the head. Nothing fancy, just basic sculpting using some alphas. And the same could be said for the clothing as well. So let's go down to, let's do the main body, because the scarf was approached in exactly the same way, and it's just the same. We're going to add a couple of divisions. Let's just undo that. Actually, let's redo it. And as you can see, the mesh has shrunk a little bit there. But we can also go in and we can just move that like so. Just center that back there. And just move that up a little bit, just so it's back underneath the scarf. Go back to drawing, and then we know we don't want the snake wrapping tightly around his body, so that's going to give us a nice starting point for where we're going to start sculpting in our creases and folds. We'll turn that alpha off. Turn our Z intensity back up. Something like that. There we go, that's better. And you notice it's sort of missing when we sculpt underneath the scarf, so because it's just a subtool, we can always just go in and hide that. At the moment we're just focusing on getting this to look like the snake's grabbing him and his clothing's sort of up, folded around. Why the snake's holding him, I've no idea. And just, again, we're just blocking in, just like we did with the head, just blocking in larger shapes first. And again, if you want more precise and realistic looking sort of folds and creases, feel free to hunt out some proper reference. And again, just like we mentioned previously with the UVs, the back of him is not going to be seen, so I wouldn't spend too much time putting in lots of intricate details around here. As long as we can see from the front, you know, we've got that detail in there. You know, just add some recesses underneath these where the folds are hanging over. Then go in, add another division. Shrink down the brush. Then we can start to add in some finer details. Sort of like so. Enhancing these folds and creases. But there you get the general idea. Like I keep saying, nothing fancy, no fancy tools. It's just a case of going over with the standard brush, maybe use the pinch brush as well to enhance some of these creases. But I'm going to leave you now to finish off working on the head and the body. and the snake and the scarf. In fact, I'd leave the snake for now because we're just going to use a noise, using the noise tool to add details to that. So let's bring back that scarf. So for now, yeah, just continue working on the head, adding in all these details to the scarf and everything. In the next video, I'll quickly demonstrate the noise tool, and then we'll start to look at adding textures. So as you can see, I've spent a bit more time working on the details and sculpting in lots more creases and obviously lots more detail into the head. We've got the wound down the middle, we've got all the stitches looking like they're being stretched, and they're pulling on the flesh around his mouth and around these open wounds. We've also used those alphas just to add a bit more detail around the eyes as well. But you'll also notice that I've not done anything on the back because it's only going to be rendered from the front, so there's no point spending time enhancing the back. I've also worked more on the clothing and the scarf, but you'll also see that the scarf and the snake have this added detail, and that is purely added in just using the noise tool. If I go to the scarf, go down to surface, what you'll see is we've got this noise tool here. If I turn that off and turn it on again, you'll see that's just being enabled and disabled. Now that isn't physically baked into the mesh, it's sort of added as an overlay. So if you want to bake out the details from this noise plugin, you have to increase your subdivisions and then apply to mesh. And then that will bake these details down onto the mesh, and that will then allow you to then export those to a displacement map or something. But to set this up is quite easy, and I did cheat a little bit. I just used some of the built-in ones. Just go to edit, and it brings up this extra box here, and you can you get a preview of what it's going to look like, and you've got all these options that you can play around with. If I just turn the alpha off, let's just cancel that. Now for this one I use the noise makers, so you click on that and it opens up this option here, and these are all sort of built-in sort of alphas, and for this I use noise 7, which is sort of a nice fabric grain, and that's what it looks like by default. But then you can go in to edit it, and then we can adjust the alpha scale just to make that smaller, you know, as small or as large as you want. Now by default it's using 3D, and as you can see around the side we're getting some stretching. But again, we spent the time working on the UVs, so why don't we use those for this? And if we switch it to UV, as you can see, it's flowing around the object a lot nicer. You know, we've got all sorts of options we can play in here. We can adjust the strength, you know, to something like that. And there, just very quickly, I've got a nice sort of fabric overlay on top of the scarf. Let's just cancel that. Let's undo that. The same was applied to the snake as well. If I go to the snake, go to surface. Now this time I didn't use the noise maker. I went into edit and I used a noise plug. Now because it's already active, I'm just going to click edit. That should bring up another window. I'll just drag this over. And in here you've got lots and lots of sort of presets that you can play around with, and these will all add like surface noise to your models. Obviously I chose snake skin. You can play around with these options in here, but then you can bring this in. It will apply it to your mesh, and then again you can adjust the scale, the size, even the colour, and also the noise curve here, all to adjust how it looks on your mesh. And again, choosing 3D, now this will work for some models, but it didn't really work for this or the scarf. So again, spent the time doing all the UVs, so why not use them to help this noise plugin flow nicely around the snake in a more uniform manner. So that's pretty much it for detailing the mesh. Like I said before, nothing complicated. Just use the noise plugins for the scarf and the snake. You could also use it for his body as well if you want that sort of cloth look. It's entirely up to you. Just some basic sculpting just to get the details into his head. So from here, it's then just a case of going in and starting to think about adding some colour. So let's go back to the head. And what we want to do is bake in a sort of flat white colour. So maybe skin shade. Now this is probably baked in already, so let's go to our colour menu. Oops. So I normally use a fill object. Well, that's going to fill it with the colour. We want it with the material. Let's just get a better UI. There we go. So we want M enabled because we want to fill it with that material. RGB intensities to full. Fill object. Let's set that to white. That's material. Or we could just use mRGB. That's it, fill object. So now we can just go to RGB. Let's just set a base colour. Maybe sort of a greeny colour. Fill the object with that. So we've defined a base material as skin shade of 4. And even if we change that, that will remain the same because we've added it in. We've applied a base colour, so now it's just a case of going in and just working on painting in extra colours and layers as well. What I like to do is just start off with big bold areas and then work on gradually onto the finer and finer details. So we could maybe just increase that, make it a bit more yellow. And I'm going to use the spray tool, and we'll maybe use an alpha again. So maybe something like alpha 24 or alpha 8. Let's try this one. Get a nice big brush. We'll turn the RGB intensity down because I don't want it really too solid. You see, and we're just using those just to give the head some. In fact, let's just hide the snake, the body and the scarf while we work on the head. So there we're just adding some variation. You know, starting big with big colours. You know, just be big and bold. Starting darker and slowly working lighter, so maybe increase that a little bit. Make it a bit pinker. As you find, as you start to build up layers, it'll just look a little bit more complex and, you know, skin-like. But obviously we don't want him to have realistic looking skin. We're just after something that looks a bit mottled, and he basically doesn't want to look very well. There, we're just continuing on, and then we can maybe drop the brush size a bit. Let's add a bit of blue in, maybe. And then I know I want the eyes to be quite dark, so let's maybe bring that down a notch like so. And we can start to sort of darken around those eyes. Those eyes want to look tired and worn. He's not had a good day, this guy. And, you know, just let's throw in a bit of red as well. Maybe even purple. Make that a bit bigger. As you can see, I'm still just using the same brush, just using the spray tool, using that same alpha. We could change it up and adjust the alphas if we wanted to, you know, for a bit more variety. We can come in and just start to maybe these cuts want to look a bit bruised around them as well. Again, I'm just going through this quite quickly. I'll pause the video and then I'll work on it further. Maybe a bit more blue. Like that. Maybe not that strong over by that eye. So let's make that a little bit smaller now. And now we're just going to start working on these cuts in here. So I'll turn this off. I'm just going to use freehand. We're just going to paint this colour in here just to enhance these wounds. And again, I'm not just going to go in and do them all, but it's quite easy just to go in and paint your mesh like this. Yeah, maybe a bit darker. Zoom in a bit more. Smaller brush. And maybe just redness spills out a little bit because this just needs to look a bit sore. But we're starting to build up the colours there. You know, using big bold strokes. We're using the spray brush with an alpha just to get sort of a mottled look on the skin. And then going in and working on the finer details to enhance the cuts. You know, we could enhance these details as well around here. But you get the general idea with that sort of process. So I'm just going to continue working on this a little bit longer, and then in the next video we'll look at it and well, look at it textured and see where we go from there. So as you can see, I've worked a bit more on the overall textures of the head, just focusing on the head really, the scarf, the body and the snake. I could paint more textures onto those, but with my particular workflow I'm quite happy to export the displacement map, the bump map, and cavity map, etc. from ZBrush, but then work on the textures further in Photoshop. And you can see I've just enhanced the cuts a little bit more, darkened the eyes, made his skin a bit more green. The eyes themselves, I'm not sure yet whether to go black or white. But again, I can play around with that later on. The eyes and the stitches don't have any UVs actually, because I'm just going to basically render them using a basic shader, and then I can tweak them and adjust them in Photoshop. But there, we're at a stage now where we can start to think, right, we've painted, we've tweaked, we've sculpted, so now we just want to get all this information out of here, back into Maya, and then we can connect all the maps up, add some lighting into the scene, and get rendering. So what do we do now? Well, it's quite easy really. All we need to do is go to Z plugin, and down here we have Multimap Exporter. I just close these up. And basically what this will do, this will go through your models and your subtools if you want to. Like down here we can export them for visible subtools too. Although for this model, I know that the head, the scarf and the body all use the same map. So we may have to hide the eyes and the stitches and the snake, because the snake's on a different map and the eyes and the stitches don't have UVs, or they might have UVs which are not ideal, so we'd need to hide those. But yeah, basically we'd hide the snake and the eyes and the stitches, enable subtools, so then it would bake the head, the scarf and the jumper, and merge all the maps together. So that would just combine all those for you into one nice tidy map. And depending on what you want to export, you just highlight them here. So we could have ambient occlusion, cavity map, even export the meshes, normal, vector, displacement, and then it's just a case of coming down here and just playing around with all the options. So mesh export, we could not, rather than export it from the very first division, export it from division 2. Now I'm going to do this because it will help to, because we've got the stitches on the head, it will help to sort of line those up with the holes properly so that the UVs don't sort of shift when we take it into Maya. But that's basically it. You set all your options in here, you hide what you don't want to export for this particular subtool. Like I say, if they're sharing the same texture page, just hide them. And then it's just a case of going in, tweaking the settings and exporting. Click create all maps, that you can specify where they'll be exported to, and then they're exported, and it's as easy as that really. So then everything will be chucked out of ZBrush onto your hard drive, and then you can bring them all into Maya and start piping them all together into your shaders. So we're pretty much done with ZBrush here. Now what I'm going to do in the next video is, I'm not going to get too bogged down in, setting up all the complicated shaders. What I will do though is, we'll get the models into Maya and we'll set up the displacement maps just so you can see that workflow and just see what's involved in that. And then out from there on, I'll leave you to play around with all the other shaders yourself. So for now, just play around with this guy a little bit more, do some more painting or sculpting. When you're ready, export all your maps, and then we'll see you in the next video.